So in Unit 3, we had talked about genetics and how traits or genes were passed on from parent to offspring. In Unit 4, that we're starting today, we're going to talk about, well, how are those traits passed on along the generations and what happens? How does that change? How do those traits or genes that are moving change? Our main focus in Unit 4 is going to be evolution. Evolution, the word itself means change over time. So if you think about our world today, we can think about things like cars, automobiles, and how they began to change over time and how they continue to change. Okay? Becoming faster, becoming smaller, becoming maybe bigger and faster as well. And also fashion has evolved over time. Think about what women used to wear and how much more they wear compared to what's considered acceptable today. But when we're thinking about evolution, we're really going to focus on change over generations. So thinking of a population like humans, and how do they change from the grandparents, to the parents, to the children, to the grandchildren, okay? 4 possible generations. And we're going to think about evolution in this big picture because things don't evolve individually. It has to be a big group that changes. So when we first think about evolution, we are going to think about the first cells that came to be. And so remember that when we talked about life, life has to start off very simple. We start off with our first cells, and they were prokaryotic cells, simple cells. And eventually we moved on to become multicellular cells, eukaryotic cells, multicellular organisms, and even larger organisms like humans. So life evolving or life changing from something simple like bacteria to something more complex like a human being. So today we're going to be starting section 4.1a, and we're going to be on page 75 of our notes. First thing that we need to talk about when we talk about evolution is the origin of life. Scientists used to believe that life came to be randomly or spontaneously. And the word we use for that is abiogenesis. So let's first of all break down this word a little. After you copy it down, make sure that you kind of add these little side notes as well. The A is going to mean not or non, just like abiotic is not living. Bio means life. And genesis means this beginning, right? So scientists used to believe that life began from something that was not living. Again, life began with something that was not living. What does that mean? Well, scientists used to think, or people in general used to think, that there was some sort of force in the air that created life, and that's how life came to be. And if you think about this randomness of it, this next word should make sense to you. Spontaneous, something randomly or suddenly occurring. Spontaneous generation. So suddenly something was built or something was made, something was created. So they thought that life was randomly created, spontaneously created. So the idea that life came from non-living material is abiogenesis. Now there are some reasons for that. If we look at the early atmosphere was very toxic to things that live now. They contain a lot of gases like carbon monoxide, nitrogen gas, and carbon dioxide. And there was no free oxygen, no oxygen that could be used. What do our cells use oxygen for? Well, we use it for respiration, the process of making ATP. And so there wasn't any free oxygen available. There was some oxygen in carbon dioxide, di being to oxide referring to oxygen, but there wasn't any free floating that we could break down and use for respiration. So because of the early atmosphere, scientists thought that living things spontaneously came to be. Now, there were some scientists that tried to prove this. So Operin was the scientist that initially thought of this idea, developed this theory that inorganic molecules could become organic molecules. Let's think about what that means. If you have an organic molecule, that means you should, or you have to contain carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. Okay? Carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. He actually thought, because of the early conditions of Earth, were very toxic, were actually very violent. There was lots of storms, as you can see in this picture. And he actually proposed this idea that everything was kind of mixed around like in a soup. And with the electricity from the lightning and all of these kind of difficult situations, that they were able to force some of those atoms together to become proteins, to become organic molecules. So remember, inorganic means no carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen combined together. Organic means carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen are combined together. Now, in support of Operin, you have two scientists, Miller and Urey, that actually created this experiment and tested those early Earth conditions. And they were able to observe the formation of organic molecules like proteins. So in this experiment, they had a water compartment, they had this gas compartment, atmosphere compartment, they had electricity to power this process, and from that they were able to get some proteins, some of the building blocks of life. Okay? So this picture is of Miller and Urey's experiment. So you might want to draw an arrow from Miller and Urey to their experiment. And just writing that this supports abiogenesis. So what does that mean? Well, what this means for us is that we do believe that part of this could be true, that the early atmosphere did force together these organic molecules. But we know now that abiogenesis by itself can't be what continued, can't be the process that continued to be. And so now we know of biogenesis, life starting from life. So life must come from life, and life began from abiogenesis. We started with life kind of being put together and forced together by the atmosphere, but it's going to continue through biogenesis. So there are some theories that abiogenesis kind of occurred, not quite in the way that early scientists thought, but there is some evidence of it being possible that those organic molecules were formed from inorganic molecules. And then eventually, though, life, living things, have to continue from other living things. All cells come from pre-existing cells. And so abiogenesis can no longer occur today. So two scientists that disproved abiogenesis, or at least disproved that abiogenesis could occur now, is going to be Reddy and Pasteur. Reddy and Pasteur were both scientists that disproved this. They had two separate experiments. One was with rotting meat, covering it up, having some flies come into one that was open, having flies not able to come to one that was closed. Okay, they're looking at this picture here. The jar with the rotting meat that the flies would come in, well, that produced some maggots, which are baby flies. But the meat that was rotting in the same condition had some gauze covering it so the air can come in. But the maggots could not. This did not have any flies, maggots growing from it. So they realized that the maggots weren't coming from something in the air, they were coming from the flies themselves. The flies were laying eggs. On the other hand, you had Louis Pasteur, and he had an S-shaped flask. And I'll show you that image of that in a second. You also have that image in your notes. But the main idea is that they both learned that life comes from living things. And those living things could be microscopic. And not from the air itself. Not from spontaneous generation. So very careful to notice that they disproved that abiogenesis occurs now, no longer happens. So looking at this picture, this is actually Louis Pasteur's experiment. He had a flask. There was some broth thrown in it, like chicken broth, so there was material, organic material there. He had one that he boiled up, and he left this S-shaped tube on it. He had another one he boiled up, but he broke off the tube. So here again, you can have the air coming in. Here, the air can come in, but also some particles in the air. The one that was broken had bacteria growing in it, or germs growing in it. And they realized that, okay, so the living things, again, did not come from the air, because the air could enter this one, but actually came from particles within the air. And that's why this one had growth in it. So then we have the evolution of the cell, and this is really what we're going to focus on in class. Evolution of the cell, what we first need to know is that mutations produced new varieties of cells that coexist. We have what's called the heterotroph hypothesis, that the first cells lacked complexity and could not make their own food. They didn't have the organelles that they would need to be able to make their own food, like chloroplasts. However, the first cells were prokaryotic before the nucleus, anaerobic, not use oxygen or O2. So no nucleus, didn't need oxygen, and they consumed food. Heterotroph or heterotrophic means you consume food. You eat food. You can't make your own food. Okay? So these are our first cells, and that's the most simple type of cell you can have. Now, as we move on to these different types of cells, keep in mind that this cell doesn't disappear. It's just that evolution occurs, some change occurs, and now we have a new type of cell, and then another type of cell, and then another type of cell. So the second type of cell was still prokaryotic. It was still anaerobic, not using oxygen, but then it became photosynthetic. It could make its own food. When you can become photosynthetic, that also means that you're called autotrophic. Okay? You can make your own food. And that means that we now produce oxygen, free oxygen that can be used. So then our third cell that evolved, the third cell that appeared, okay, was aerobic. Now we're using oxygen. Prokaryotic. The atmosphere now is filled with oxygen, so that's why we're aerobic. And it's because of those photosynthesizing second cells. So make sure you take a minute to read over and think about that. And this word right here does say now, not no. Okay, now. And the last thing here, the last part here is the Endosymbiotic Theory, and this is going to explain the evolution of eukaryotic cells. So there are three main things here. Make sure you take a minute to read over this first. We're talking about aerobic prokaryotes becoming mitochondria, photosynthetic prokaryotes becoming chloroplasts, and evidence that both of these things, chloroplasts and mitochondria, have their own DNA. When you look at this picture, you want to look at the fact that we had these separate. What we're really saying is that mitochondria and chloroplasts used to be bacteria. We know that they used to be bacteria because both of these things had their own DNA. For some reason, maybe it helped them survive better. The mitochondria, prokaryotic cell, bacteria, and the chloroplast, like bacteria, somehow moved into this larger prokaryotic cell and eventually produced our eukaryotic cell. This is really important, so you want to read over this and make sure you understand those three details. And that's going to be it for today.